Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Dr. Peter St. Onge about money in the digital age, Bitcoin, and cryptocurrencies. Dr. St. Onge is an assistant professor at Fengjia University College of Business in Taiwan and the editor of ProfitsOfChaos.com. You can follow his work at ProfitsOfChaos.com, and you can find him on Facebook under Peter J. St. Onge and on Twitter at PJ St. Onge. For more information, see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Bitcoin. Dr. St. Onge, welcome to the show.
Thank you, guys. It's great to be here.
So let's start off with the basics of money. So what is money? What is a medium of exchange? And how does a medium of exchange become a type of money?
Right. So fundamentally, there's two purposes that money serves. Historically, money has been seen as this sort of magical, almost like a veil, different from all other products. And there's a character named Karl Menger, who in the 19th century had sort of a breakthrough with money, which was a foundation of the Austrian school, his breakthrough. And that breakthrough is to see money as a good just like any other. Right, so just like an automobile has a couple of different purposes, right? The main one is to transport you. There's secondary purposes, looking good on a Friday night, or staying comfortable in the rain or whatever. So money has two main purposes, and those are to make transactions cheaper and as a store of value. Right, so fundamentally, the transaction and savings. Right, purposes. Transactions is typically what you keep in your wallet, right? And savings is what you keep in the bank or buried in the backyard or something. So much the more important of the two of them, therefore, is savings, right? Almost all money in existence is going to be saved at any given moment, right? If you were to take a snapshot of all of the interactions in the economy, first of all, there's no money that's actually flowing, right? A snapshot at any given moment, you would have no money that is flying through the air, right? All money at any given moment, at every moment, is possessed by somebody. And the reason that they're possessing it, right, is because they're accepting it in exchange for other material goods. And why would they do that, right? Why would a farmer give up milk, or why would 7-Eleven give up stuff in return for these bits of paper? Well, they're doing it because, it can be used to transact in the future, right? So 7-Eleven is going to need to transact. They're going to need to pay the power bill or something. And B, because it can be saved, right? So 7-Eleven can pass it on to somebody, and eventually somebody, whether it's 7-Eleven or a shareholder, is going to put that into the bank, right? So fundamentally, this is the function of money. And when we're talking about money, we don't want to sort of get into this mystical world where we step away from real things, and now, we talk about psychology and whatnot. Rather, analyze money very clearly as it is a good, it's like a tennis racket. It's like any other good, and that good is serving two purposes. It's helping you to cheaply exchange things, and it's helping you to store that purchasing power for later. In other words, savings.
So one tool that has helped us to some degree understand what money is, and this is been challenged and debated recently because of what's happened in the digital age, but that tool is the regression theorem. So forgetting about the digital age for a moment, what is the regression theorem, and where does the regression theorem come from?
Right, so fundamentally the regression theorem is a hypothesis, okay, which says that in order for something to become money, it needs to have had some other purpose, right, before it was money. And so that would distinguish, quote-unquote, real money, such as gold or garden hose or salt. Right? There are a variety of real things that have been used throughout history as money in various cultures. Right? So the idea that in order to become sort of a natural money, right, in order to emerge from the market, a money, right, in other words, a method of exchanging or saving value or storing value, right? A money must have come from something that previously had some value. Okay, so gold is valuable as jewelry, salt is valuable to eat, so on. So these are natural monies. And it's true that what you don't see historically is fiat currencies emerge from the free market, right? Even where you have paper money, right? For example, paper money issued by a bank, okay? Even when that's a free market process, it will only be accepted by the market if it can ultimately be exchanged for something that in turn does have value, right? So for example, a bank can issue paper, right? And banks have issued paper for, depending on the region, between about 500 and 1,000 years. So private sector banks have issued pieces of paper, but that paper was always redeemable for typically gold or silver, right? But it was always redeemable for something useful. And so the idea is that the only way that you can have a world where you have sort of floating pieces of paper that are not exchangeable for anything whatsoever is in a fiat system, right? That's not something that's going to emerge from the market. Now, Bitcoin becomes interesting, and that was the point of my article on Mises, because Bitcoin on its face violates this, right? Before Bitcoin was a currency, it was useless, right? It was nothing. It was an idea. So it was born and it became currency on the very same day, right? If Bitcoin ceased if it was no longer currency, then I can't imagine what you would use a Bitcoin. I mean, it just wouldn't exist. And the argument that I make in the article at Mises is that we need to expand the regression theorem so that it's not a question of whether the thing had value. Okay, it's a question of whether the application had value. Right, so in this case, for example, okay, some of the things that Bitcoin provides that previous means of payment didn't. Okay, so for example, that you had very low transaction fees, right? So because Bitcoin, because of its architecture, you don't have a middleman in the center. Well, the point here is that Bitcoin offered a bundle of features that was different than the competing cash-based electronic payment system, and the benefits. My argument in this article here, at any rate, is that those benefits themselves indicates that there was latent demand for. It didn't have to be Bitcoin, but there was latent demand that Bitcoin took advantage of, and that latent demand fills the purpose that would normally be filled by the object having had some previous use, right? So if you're trying to come up with a currency that has no benefits to cash, then you can still beat cash for a number of applications, right? You can basically steal demand away from cash if you're offering some bundle of benefits. So that then makes that carries into the question of what's going to happen to the price of Bitcoin, right? That's just going to devolve into, well, what's happening to those various applications? Are cash payment systems catching up? Are they falling behind? Are the benefits eroding? So on and so forth.
Yeah, give us a bit more information on Bitcoin, a little bit more on how it started and why some people now are saying that Bitcoin is dead or it's going into a dying phase.
Right. Yeah. So I think you guys have been following Bitcoin for a while, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, right. There's, dozens of times, hundreds of times Bitcoin was supposed to be dead. It's always theoretically possible that, this is the one time that the world will end. But at any rate, I think in general we want to be a little bit skeptical of claims that Bitcoin will die. People have claimed this a lot. The current issue, I don't want to take sides on it because I know that a lot of people have strong feelings. But at any rate, I think that the current issue with it is sort of a question of to what extent is Bitcoin an alternative processing system akin to PayPal, right? Versus to what extent Bitcoin is sort of a revolutionary, a brand new type of currency that cuts governments completely out of it. And I think that sort of philosophical question, especially a lot of the early adherents to Bitcoin were very excited about this sort of libertarian ideal, right? Because the fact that Bitcoin is decentralized means that it is a lot harder for governments to control. Apparently not impossible, but it is at any rate a lot harder, right? It's similar to Napster, for example, right, where you have this distributed network and it's much harder to shut down. Of course, Napster did have a central point, which is why Napster could be shut down. But anyway, so that group that was quite excited about the sort of political implications of it are, I think, a little bit bumping up against the fact that the lower transaction fees benefit, right, as mundane as that is very, very attractive for a much wider range of the market. Right, so for example, people are using Bitcoin to send remittances home from Saudi Arabia to the Philippines, right? So that's traditionally a market that would take a huge cut in fees, and Bitcoin can eliminate those fees. And so a lot of the demand now is coming from people who are using Bitcoin not because they have any particular opinion about the philosophical implications of a decentralized system, but they're simply using it because it's cheap from their perspective, right? It just has lower transactions. And so it's kind of tricky because it does set up an incentive mismatch in a way, because if you want Bitcoin to go up in price, then you probably want it to be structured in a way that it chases the biggest chunk of demand. And the biggest chunk of demand is probably not motivated by libertarian ideology, right? The biggest chunk of demand just wants, bananas 5 cents cheaper, right? That's a huge market. So if you are sort of rooting for Bitcoin to go up in price in the future, then you would probably relatively be interested in streamlining it. On the contrary, you may even want the opposite. Right? In other words, if you're trying to promote uses of Bitcoin as an alternative to like PayPal or credit cards or something, then you would probably actually want to partner with governments in terms of the price per Bitcoin. There's a good argument to make for actually sort of working with China and trying to encourage them to not create a competing currency, rather to use Bitcoin. So there's kind of a core, I think, philosophical debate between the two sides there.
So what are some other examples of cryptocurrencies that have been tried, and why has Bitcoin found more success than those other cryptocurrencies?
That's a good question. I don't exactly know why Bitcoin itself took off. I mean, it's one of the earlier ones. There are hundreds. I think there are probably many different currencies. So there's Dogecoin, AliCoin. I don't know. There are hundreds. Some of them do have active markets, and getting that they are sort of sustainable, right? They've apparently proven themselves good enough to get sustainable demand to the point where the prices. I mean, there are competing markets to Bitcoin. The vast majority of our capitalization, right? So if you take the number of coins, right, whatever. Coins, whatever. Take of coins times the price, that's the market capitalization. Bitcoin is overwhelmingly the cryptocurrency market. But right, there are a number of competing coins. The ones that survive, in other words, the ones that have pricing, non-zero prices, those coins all offer some benefit, right? So some of them are faster than Bitcoin, for example. You guys may well know more about the technical details of the differences. But right, there are a number of currencies, and what sort of going back to that or relating this to the earlier question of this sort of internal ideological war. If indeed Bitcoin does just become another PayPal in the future, right? If it gets sort of taken over by the people who are simply using it for transactions and don't defend, the anonymity aspects of it. So if that were to happen, right? If Bitcoin were to sort of sell out, and just become another standard corporate service, I don't think it would actually be as catastrophic as people think, right? First of all, it would probably be quite good for the price. So if, whatever true believers bought in early, they're going to come out pretty happy anyway. Secondly, the value is not really Bitcoin. The value is the demand that Bitcoin filled, right? And whether or not Bitcoin survives, right? Whether or not it has some fundamental flaw in it, or is taken over by governments or by the 51% or whatnot. Whatever happens to Bitcoin, the point is that the demand for the various benefits that Bitcoin offered, that will always be there, right? Which are anonymity in transactions, anonymity in savings, particularly the ability to keep savings out of reach, right? In the Chinese market, for example, which is the overwhelming demand for Bitcoins nowadays, a lot of the application is simply investing overseas, right, which the Chinese government doesn't want its own people to do. And so that's, of course, it's a very large dollar sum. So I think that in a sense, it doesn't really matter what happens to Bitcoin in terms of how powerful the impact of cryptocurrencies is ultimately going to be on governments, because even if Bitcoin goes, somebody else is going to come in. The point is that black markets are growing. Right, they're a massive part of the world economy even today. Right, there's some countries in Europe where the black market is up to a third of GDP. So black markets are growing, right? As governments come out with more regulations and more taxes, every new tax, every new regulation is, it's like fertilizer to the black market. It just makes it grow and grow. And so I think that there will always be demand for an anonymous currency that can work in the black market. Whether or not that's Bitcoin, I don't know.
All right. Now, before we move on, just to make sure we're not leaving anybody in our audience in the dust, I want to ask you if you can define three terms that we've been using and that are often used in this sort of discussion. So cryptocurrency, which we've just been talking about, of course. Mining, which you mentioned earlier, but the audio was breaking up a little bit, and then blockchain. So can you define those three terms for us before we move on?
Yeah, so right. So cryptocurrency means a type of, and this is my understanding. I'm absolutely not an expert on the technical details. So cryptocurrency is a currency where it derives value from being validated, and that validation can either happen in some central location or it can happen in a distributed network, which is how Bitcoin works. And the validation involves some sort of mathematical equation. It is, let's see. Now I'm starting to stretch out of my territory. But anyway, so my understanding, which a number of your listeners will probably scoff at, is that it's essentially encoded on both ends. And so in order to, meaning that it's very difficult to spend a Bitcoin that doesn't belong to you, right? Basically, you can get authentication from the actual owner so that they can verify whether or not that's actually their Bitcoin. I'm certain that the technical details there are wrong, but that's my closest ability to explain it. Mining comes from this actually sort of strange, well, there are reasons for it, but at any rate, mining is how new Bitcoins are made. Bitcoin is set to grow at a more or less predictable rate of inflation, so it's currently about 8%, and it's on its way to 4%. Right? The rate of inflation goes down as more are mined. Mined means that companies basically buy servers, and they tell these servers to solve these mathematical equations. If they solve, which is more or less busy work, the mathematical equations aren't really used for anything. Again, I'm open to correction. But the point of it is to introduce a cost to inflating the currency, right? So the electricity and the capital costs of running the servers that are solving this, the computers that are solving this equation, functionally act as a tax on creation of new currency, and so this means that the currency doesn't grow without limit. From a technical perspective, you really could have set up Bitcoin with simply zero inflation. In other words, there's no particular reason to have inflation. It's not important for anything. It just changes numbers. But my understanding is that the reason why they structured it that way was they needed those computers to propagate the blockchain, and in order for those companies to be incentivized to spread the blockchain around, they had to get paid somehow. And so the system sort of automatically pays them by giving them new coins, right? So they're incentivized to basically provide the infrastructure that keeps the blockchain going, on which Bitcoin depends. And then blockchain itself is essentially a distributed ledger, right? So it's basically a long list, right? You can think of it like a shopping list that's miles and miles long. And it lists all of the transactions that have occurred on Bitcoin. They're all coded so that, like, in other words, you couldn't just grab the blockchain and read off and see what everybody bought, right? So it is all coded, hence the more or less anonymous nature of the system. And the trick there is that this long list of transactions, right, because the miners are incentivized to propagate this, it's then spread all over, and so a lot of different people have a copy of the list. And the reason that you have to do that is essentially to verify that the ongoing record of transactions, right? Basically, the way that you verify that that's correct is that you see if there's a consensus among people propagating the same version of it, and not. First of all, I don't want to get too far into that, and even so, I would probably stretch further and further from accuracy. So hopefully, those clarify more than they muddy. But at any rate, that's my understanding of the three moving parts. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think they definitely clarify more than they muddy.
And obviously, governments, as we've been saying, are not really a big fan of these cryptocurrencies. So what has the crackdown been from governments on these types of currencies? And how is this all connected to the war on cash?
Yeah, I think that, if anything, I think it's been most surprising that governments have not been as aggressive in trying to shut down Bitcoin. They've mostly targeted applications, for example, Silk Road, right? So they were quite aggressive against Silk Road. They are starting to get more aggressive. There was just a father and son duo in Louisiana who were, they're facing 5 years for operating an unlicensed money exchange, and they were trading Bitcoin for, for other things like currency and whatnot. And so the allegation was not that they were engaging in fraud. In other words, they didn't rip anybody off, but they are facing 5 years now for not operating with a license. So they've just started getting a little bit more aggressive. But I think in the community overall, it's been surprising the how restrained they've been. I think to their credit. But I think the other surprise and maybe the biggest risk actually is China's response, right? So Bitcoin use in China is, in terms of dollars or whatever, of amounts, a lot of it is essentially being used for tax evasion or to go around regulatory restrictions on investors. So I think that's actually been quite surprising that, again, China's not very active on it. So I think governments in general have been taking a sort of wait-and-see approach. Who knows what they're going to do, especially as administrations change. So I'm not familiar enough with, Trump or Clinton to know if they would change the stance.
Yeah, I don't think either of them have discussed Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, but I guess once they get into office, who knows what would happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so we've had some recent news around Bitcoin within the last few weeks and months. Some issues with capacity and processing speeds and some infighting. So what are some of the recent events and concerns related to Bitcoin?
At that point, we're definitely getting beyond my technical depth. The debate currently, so there's a guy named, I believe, Richard Hearn, the Hearnageddon, they call it, but he's sort of a prominent developer in Bitcoin who quit in frustration at more or less this debate between the two sides who want to see it evolve maybe a little bit closer to kind of a payment service versus the side who is sort of more interested in what Bitcoin ideologically represents. And that debate sort of naturally blends over into a debate about governance of the standard itself, right? So the issue with Bitcoin is that it's not structured as a company, right? There's no CEO of Bitcoin. There's nothing centralized. So it's structured a lot more like a kind of a software project, right? Sort of like open source. And so this means that the governance of Bitcoin is not entirely stable. In other words, it's not exactly clear who runs it in the sense that sometimes you have to make changes to the code in Bitcoin, right? You have to make changes to how it fundamentally works. And it's not entirely clear exactly who gets to make those changes. And those two sides more or less line up on the governance issue as well, right? So the what I'm calling the payment transaction side is trying to make a number of changes that are supposed to speed up transactions, right? Specifically, that's the biggest complaint at the moment. And then the other side, the sort of more ideologically interested side. I'm not saying that as a criticism, by the way. I'm personally sympathetic, but at any rate, the sort of more ideologically interested side is a little bit more interested in keeping the governance of the standard the way that it's always been, right? In other words, you don't just have 51% cram their opinion down everybody's throat. Rather, there has to be a broad consensus on any kind of change. So, part of it is sort of philosophical growing pains. The internet went through a very similar process I guess about 30 years ago now, where, there was sort of a core set of developers who were all friends. They all knew each other. They all resolved things as gentlemen. And over time, a number of interested parties got involved. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Right. In other words, the fact that there are large companies now that make a lot of money on Bitcoin, right? Either they sell stuff in Bitcoin, or they do it as tech companies. The fact that there are these companies that are now interested in it, that's not really a bad thing, because that indicates that it's a mature ecosystem, right? It's not just like a bunch of guys sitting around fantasizing about something that could be, but now it actually is a real thing. So it's good in a sense, but it also means that now you've got a variety of interests involved, right? You've got a bunch of people who, at any rate, it's a lot harder to get consensus because different people have different interests, and that'll probably increase with time. But the internet, I mean, this is something that basically happens anytime that you have a new standard. If the standard doesn't take off, then sure, it stays as a hobby horse and everybody can still be friends and they can all hang out in their basement and fantasize about what might be one day. But if the standard takes off and is successful, then yes, you're going to have this conflict, especially between the people who had the original vision versus the sort of self-interested parties who are, coming to the revolution after the smoke cleared. And
do you think we're going to see any other sorts of new cryptocurrencies pop up, or where do you think we're going from here?
They're constantly popping up, and it's a very healthy market, right? Now that the trail has sort of been blazed, we've sort of seen proof of concept with Bitcoin, which I would argue is even if Bitcoin were to die, which I don't think is likely in the near term, the proof of concept is enormously important. So now other people can follow that path. So. We have a lot of other currencies. If nothing dramatic happens to Bitcoin, then I think it's quite unlikely that these other currencies will take off. And the reason is that, first off, you have a sort of winner-take-all called a network effect within currencies, right? So, even in the real world, once people start using pieces of 8 in North America, then now everybody pretty much has to use pieces of 8. So, I mean, you do have these sort of network effects. For example, vendors have to accept Bitcoin. There's certain costs associated with that. So if nothing dramatic happens to Bitcoin, then I think that these other currencies probably won't take off. The only way that they would is if they could find some killer app that was hugely better than Bitcoin, right? And so that would basically be duplicating Bitcoin's own birth process, right? So in the case of Bitcoin, before Bitcoin, you could still transmit money to people wirelessly, right? You could do it with a credit card, or you could do it with a wire transfer, bank transfer, right? So Bitcoin didn't invent something that for most users was impossible before, but what Bitcoin did do was do it a lot better in certain ways, right? There were certain benefits. I would argue principally lower transaction fees and anonymity. If somebody else comes up with a digital currency that either does one of those things better, if Bitcoin continues to get slower and slower, and somebody else, then you might also see demand shifting over. So, it's possible that somebody could, that one of these emerging currencies could pick up demand from Bitcoin if Bitcoin either gets bad in some way, or if the new currency is far superior in some way. But in terms of probabilities, I shouldn't have said that so confidently. In terms of probabilities, who the heck knows? I would guess that, near term, I think that it's probably worth a speculative bet on some of the near competitors. If you're betting on the near competitors, you basically would want to identify what feature you think that competitor does better, right? So, and if some competing currency does something better than Bitcoin, it seems like most of them are trying to compete on speed of transaction. So if that competing currency does X better than Bitcoin, then yes, it's probably worth a speculative investment. But then in the sort of more important question, is Bitcoin going to go up? Is it going to go down? Is it going to die? I think it's quite unlikely that it dies. Personally, I think it's probably going to go up before it goes down. So I think that it is worth, even in Bitcoin, I think that it's still worth a speculative bet. But I think, probably, especially for people who are not invested in Bitcoin, who have never used it, right? For people who sort of have a casual acquaintance with it, probably the most important question to them is just, is this some hokey, tech project that, is this just smoke and mirrors? And that was part of what I addressed in my article, and I think that it's absolutely not hokey smoke and mirrors. It's an excellent idea. The devils are in the details, right? But if we sort of boil the concept down to it's a PayPal where you have a limited number of chits, right? You go to a casino, you get casino chits. Okay, it's a PayPal with a limited number of chits. So it isn't hokey. It's fundamentally probably not that impenetrable. Like if you were to ask me how the internet works, I think my technical abilities would be probably no better than my explanation of Bitcoin. Yet we're all quite confident using the internet. Right. I don't think it's smoke and mirrors. I think it's absolutely a going concern. And then the risks going forward are going to be: does a competing currency do something much better? On the one hand, and on the other hand, do governments start hunting Bitcoin? In which case, of course, that would reduce the price because it would reduce demand for it.
Well, it will definitely be interesting to see what happens and to follow these developments. We're sort of entering uncharted waters here. And that's always exciting to follow.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, it's a very exciting. Whatever happens to it, it's a very exciting time, I think, for everybody involved. So. Yeah,
no, I think that's right. All right, so before we wrap up, can you talk a little bit about your article? Again, we've been referencing this thing here and there over the course of the interview, but can you talk a little bit more about that, and then also what you recommend anyone who's interested in this topic read to go find out more, and also talk a little bit about where to follow your work, and in particular, profitsofchaos.com.
Yeah, right, so I guess I'll start from the back, just get that out of the way.
Sure.
Right, so... I do write at profitschaos.com. It's a blog. Mostly I talk about investing. talk about investing and some VC issues. And I am an Austrian economist, so everything that I look at, generally I look at through that lens. The article itself was over at Mises.org. The Mises Institute, of course, does a lot of research and advocacy from a libertarian point of view, and specifically an Austrian economics point of view. They have been getting more into cryptocurrencies, but they haven't historically had a whole lot on cryptocurrencies, and that's probably because there's sort of a division within the libertarian world between people who are in favor of gold and people who like cryptocurrencies. And, I would argue that cryptocurrencies actually have a number of benefits compared to gold. The single biggest cost of gold historically has been storage. Okay, storage of gold is horrific. A lot of people today own gold where they don't pay storage, but the reason is because you don't actually own gold. If you think you own gold and you're not paying for storage, it's not gold, it's paper. But anyway, that's a much longer story. So right, that sort of accounts for this division within libertarianism, and I would argue that for a lot of applications, Bitcoin is actually superior to gold. In terms of where to, I read willy-nilly. I do not have a good source on cryptocurrencies in general. Some of the Coinbase, for example, maintains a lot of articles, but I'm really not a good source for that, unfortunately.
All right. Well, we'll still go ahead and link to that, and link to your Mises.org article, of course, your Twitter account, prophetsofchaos.com, Facebook. So all of that can be found at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Bitcoin. So again, for everybody, wakeupcallpodcast.com/Bitcoin is going to be the place to go for all of those links and resources. And on that note, thank you, Dr. St. Onge, for joining us to help us tackle such an interesting topic that's been in the news a lot over the last couple of years, and where I think a lot of people, myself included, are still confused about a lot of the implications of all of this.
Yeah, we're all in there together.
Yeah.
Okay, guys.
All right, so thank you, and we'd love to speak with you again sometime.
Okay, guys. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.